Hi, I'm Ashley with Campbell. Thanks for investing your time to help your community be a great place to live. Before you watch the video, make sure to click the subscribe button so that we can help you make educated decisions as a board member.
Your Zoom taskbar. And then as soon as we get to the end of the class, then we'll open that up for those questions, and I'll come back on screen and answer as many as I can. So let's dive in here. All right, so just, I guess a little bit more information about our company. We are the oldest and largest reserve study provider in the US. We've been in business now since 1986. My office is one of more than a dozen offices scattered throughout the country. And I would say probably 90+% of the work that we do is for all different types of community associations. We also work with other types of facilities like schools and churches, large scale communities, resorts, golf and country clubs, churches, fraternity and sorority buildings, airfields, marinas. I'm trying to think what else we do, but sometimes the joke I make is that if you have a roof, if you have an air conditioner, if you have a parking lot, if you have a coat of paint, then you should have a plan for how to pay for those things over time. So really a reserve study can be applied to almost any type of physical property. But what we're going to be talking about today, of course, is mostly relevant to the condo and HOA world, which I'm sure represents all of you guys out there. So let's see. In total, our Florida team, just to kind of zoom in on our Florida staff, we're at 22 people now. We have a statewide presence. We have staff that work remotely, kind of all over the state. So just about everywhere in Florida, we should be able to get to within a relatively short drive. Among my team, we've got a bunch of folks with engineering degrees, but also architecture, construction management, business, and accounting. You'll see on their next screen, we've got quite a few of us that have earned that RS credential, and quite a few more that are in the pipeline to do so. Let's see, we've been fortunate to be recognized with the Reader's Choice Award. We can soon update that. It's now actually 13 years in a row, so I'm very proud of our staff and very grateful to all of our clients who have voted for us there over the years. I guess the last thing I'll point out for now is that our only job as a company is preparing reserve studies. Okay, we are not a engineering firm that does them on the side, or an accounting firm that doesn't have the kind of technical chops and know-how to understand useful life and cost estimates. We are a very specialized consulting firm. We focus on doing this one thing really well, which is to guide our clients towards a successful financial future. The means for doing that, the way that we do that, is a reserve study, right? That is the forecast. That's the budget that they use to help pay for those major projects. So overall, if we do our job well and our clients actually follow the plans that we design for them, hopefully the end goal of that is that they can reduce the risks of special assessments and bank loans and any other types of financial distress. So if you'd like any additional information, I'll just plug our website right now. It's very simple. It's reservestudy.com. Or if you want to shoot me an email, I will have my email address up on the screen. If you want to take that down now, it's W Simons. So WSIMONS at reservestudy.com. And I believe Ashley will also include all my contact information in the follow-up email later today. So just real quickly, this is the staff that we have in Florida that are currently as reserve specialists, but within really, I think in the next couple of weeks or month or two, we're going to add a couple more names to that list. I'm very proud of our staff that have worked hard. It actually takes 3 years of experience before you can even apply for the RS. So not something that they give away lightly. Okay. All right. So before we get into the material, this is just a very short outline of what I'm going to cover today. Really two sections for you guys. The first section is going to focus on the philosophy, or maybe the reasoning behind why it's important to have reserves, right? I think that's a question that sometimes we overlook, but I definitely want to zoom in and focus on that for some time here in the beginning. Basically frame it as another question. Why is it not okay for associations to just pass a special assessment or go out and borrow money every time they need to do a big project? Right. I teach another class called Fundamentals of Reserves. And in that class, we talk a lot about percent funded and how that's a very useful metric and tool for measuring the strength of an association's reserve fund. So that's more about kind of the how. I think today we're going to focus on the why. Okay, then the second part of the class is the explanation of the two main methodologies, what we call the pooled method and how that compares to the straight line method, which is kind of the old-fashioned way of funding reserves, but we'll spend a lot more time on that towards the end. First question, though, right out the gate, why have reserves? Okay, I think this should be pretty obvious, but there's a nuance here that is worth exploring. So as a hypothetical question, you guys maybe, think to yourselves what your answer would be. What are reserves for? Maybe when are they important? Why do associations collect them? Do you want to save this money or do you want to charge your owners this money in the present day, or is it something you worry about only in the future? Okay, so think about that for a moment. Okay, by now, hopefully you've got your answer. And I want to emphasize to everybody out there that reserve funding should be thought of in the present, in the current moment. If you were thinking that reserves are savings for the future, that's very, very common. You're certainly not alone there. But the point I want to make is that reserve funding should be in the here and now. The reason why we feel that way, we think it's a misunderstanding to think of reserve funding as saving up for a future project. And the reason why that's not the best approach is that there's oftentimes a very good chance that the owners who live in a property now will not be there at the time some of their major future expenses take place. Okay. So if that's true, it would seem to make sense to them that they should not be funding reserves for some project that they won't be around to benefit from. I think that's completely backwards, right? Think of it in a different way. If you think of reserve funding as paying the current bill of deterioration to offset the loss of useful life for your components that is happening in the present, that is the much more appropriate way to think of it, right? You're paying as you go. The byproduct of doing that is that you accumulate funds over time such that when something needs to be done, then you're prepared for it. But it's a total missed opportunity if you think of reserve funding as only being for the future and something you worry about much down the road. Okay, so we want to illustrate this concept in our reserve studies, and to do so, we include this table. Looks like what you see on the screen here. The second column from the right, okay, this deterioration cost per year. I move my mouse over that right now. Okay, so the deterioration cost per year is calculated very simply. We take the current cost estimate for any given component and we divide by its useful life. Okay, so if I look at the very last row in this top section, what I've outlined here in red, okay, this is a site and grounds category, and we're talking about a landscaping refurbishment project. Okay, if I take the current cost estimate, $100,000, and the useful life of 20 years, 100,000 divided by 20 means that my deterioration cost per year is $5,000. Okay. What does that mean, right? That means that this association should be funding its reserve account, putting away $5,000 each year just to keep pace with or offset that deterioration. Okay, notice on this table, we do not show any remaining useful life estimates. Okay, we are not showing the client, at least right here, whether or not that landscaping project is due now or in 12 years or in 19 years from now. Okay, that's intentional. We want to emphasize that deterioration happens all the time, right? So if you're thinking of it as paying it as an annual bill, not just waiting until something has reached the end of its life, because that leads to having to pay for it all at once, right? The whole point of reserve funding is that it never stops. Every single year, you should be offsetting that rate of deterioration for each component by paying the combined total cost of deterioration here, which in this case added up to about $280,000. Another point to mention here, this will increase, right? Every single year that will increase due to inflation. That's going to impact the current cost estimates and then whatever you're dividing your useful life into. Okay, so just to drive that point home for everybody, because we have a lot of clients that are newer properties. that are saying, well, we don't have anything going on for the next 10 years, right? All of our components are new and in good shape. So we can kick the can down the road a little bit. We'll wait and we'll start saving for that later on. That is very similar to, a working professional, say, 40 years old saying, okay, I'm going to start saving for retirement now because, my retirement date is now within 25 years. They would be much better off if they had started earlier, say, age 20, saving for retirement, because you're spreading the cost of that obligation over a much longer period of time. Okay, reserve funding is basically the same way. You want to spread the cost of ownership, pay for everything as you go over as long of a timeline as possible so that it minimizes that annual cost to your association. All right. In our industry, in our business, we talk about these 4 reserve rules. Okay. The first rule here is that the expenses are inevitable. There's just no getting around the fact that your air conditioning systems will need to be replaced, elevators need to get modernized, roads need to be repaved, and so on. Right? Those things will happen. Number 2, the board, I should say the board of directors, is responsible. Okay, they are the ones entrusted with managing the community association on behalf of all of their fellow owners. Number 3, when projects get delayed, they tend to get more expensive, right? And you can imagine this is very easy to understand when you're thinking of something like a roof or a exterior painting and waterproofing project. By not doing that work, you are accelerating the problems, right? As water continues to get into a building, it's going to cause more and more structural damage. So delaying the timeline of getting those things done is only going to make them worse and ultimately more expensive. Now, lastly, the homeowners, right? The residents, the members, whatever you want to call it, they are the ones who are going to get stuck paying this bill, right? There is no Uncle Sam, there's no government bailout that's coming along for community associations that do not have adequate reserves. Okay, just like there are those 4 rules for reserve planning, we like to say there are only 4 options for how to pay these expenses. So the first and best option, we're going to go from left to right here, of course, is to have a healthy reserve fund. You have cash in the bank, it's earning interest, all of the owners have paid into that over time. That is the most efficient, most effective way to cover these inevitable costs. The next best option would actually be a special assessment. Now, obviously, we're using a skull and crossbones warning here with intention. If you've ever managed a community or lived in a community that has ongoing recurring special assessments, right? You're passing the hat every time something breaks and you need to fix it. Hopefully you'll kind of appreciate what we mean here. This is a toxic thing for communities to go through. This is not a very business-like way of running an association. Okay, the next best option after a special assessment would be to borrow some money. You take out a loan or have a line of credit to pay for these things. Now, the reason I would rank that behind a special assessment in terms of priority is because it's going to be more costly, right? Anytime you're borrowing money, you're paying interest, and that's just going to add to the overall cost burden for your membership. It may spread it out over a longer period of time, but ultimately we know it's going to be more expensive. Now, what if you don't do any of those 3, right? You do not have reserves, you can't or won't pass a special assessment, and you're unable to borrow money. Remember, the expenses are inevitable. The project, the property will continue to deteriorate, to fall into disrepair. And where you will then feel that financial pinch is when your owners go to list their units, right? Now, all of a sudden, you're going to feel that in the marketplace. If your curb appeal is suffering, if your amenities are not up to date, if you just have not physically maintained the property, when you go out to sell it, you are not going to get the rates that you should have gotten compared to comparable properties at that point. So it's ultimately just that decline in property value that if you're not convinced by any of the first 3, you will feel it in the end, one way or another. All right, these are some of the specific benefits of having a healthy reserve fund. So starting at the top here, you shouldn't have any surprises, or at least a much lower chance of getting caught by surprise, right? How does that work? Well, if you're funding your reserves properly, if you're taking this stuff seriously and you're paying attention each year at budget time, you are tracking the remaining life expectancies of your components, right? You should have some sense of what is next on the agenda. What is the next big thing we're going to have to deal with? When you're thinking like that, you're going to have the option to plan ahead and prepare for when that will need to be done rather than being in a reactive mode and getting caught by surprise ultimately when something fails and you haven't been thinking about it. Okay, when you're planning ahead like that, you have the option to evaluate your choices, right? To shop around, to get multiple quotes from lots of different providers, maybe to hire a consultant or a project manager to help you evaluate that cost, right? You can also, maybe in some cases, even have an opportunity to minimize the cost by talking with the contractor. For example, you can find out from your painting company, hey, do you guys have a slow season, right? Is there a better time of year or some other, arrangement we can work out where we can get, a better price point? Are you doing other work in our area and you'll already have, a crews and equipment nearby? Is there some, manufacturer, some product out there that's got a discount we might be able to take advantage of? As opposed to, on the flip side, if you're calling out to those contractors on an emergency basis, right? You don't have time because it's an emergency, right? Something like your cooling tower failing in the middle of summer, right? You don't have time on your side to think about replacement. You've got to get somebody out there to fix it today. And usually when that happens, you're going to pay a higher fee for it because it's a rush job at that point. Now, the part here about minimizing exposure for you board members, you guys should listen up here. If you are proactively taking care of your property, right? If you are going through the steps, doing your due diligence, having a very systematic approach to budgeting each year, I think you're doing a better job of upholding your fiduciary duty to the members. That will give you better protection against any potential complaints or even lawsuits from the owners. Now, tying this all together, if you are doing these things, if you're being proactive, if you're taking a business-like approach to running the association, that's going to show, right? You're going to have better curb appeal. You'll be more up to date with respect to technology. It's going to show in the form of the buyer's perception in the marketplace, right? It's a better ownership experience for the people who live there now, but that also makes them more attractive to potential buyers, which is all else being equal, going to help increase your property value. Of course, the opposites are all true. If you don't have a healthy reserve fund, if you're not managing this properly, you are more exposed to surprises, which can lead to higher expenses, more liability exposure, and possibly even those declining property values that we want to avoid. So the biggest problem with this cycle is that once you slip into this, it becomes very difficult to stop it and to break back out of that process. Okay, just to kind of leave you with a couple of thoughts on this last section. There's a great quote from Upton Sinclair here. It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it, right? That's what, we see that all the time. People put blinders on. They ignore reality because they're incentivized to do so. So I've kind of repurposed this quote for our discussion here. It is difficult to get a man to understand something when avoiding increases in his association budget depends on his not understanding it, right? So maybe that resonates with some of you guys out there. We have a lot of clients, a lot of properties we've worked with over the years where the historical mindset has been to delay, defer, ignore, bury your head in the sand and assume it's going to be somebody else's problem because you don't want to pay more of an annual dues or monthly dues for your property. That's just not realistic. It's not good business judgment. So if you're running into this mindset in the community, let's try to educate and inform people to the consequences of that mindset. Okay, so that was a quick tour through kind of the philosophy, why this stuff is important. Hopefully some good takeaways from you guys there. What we're going to do now is pivot into our second portion, which is talking a little bit more technically about the two ways that associations actually calculate their reserve funding obligations. First one I'm going to talk about is what we call the straight line method. Now, there is another term in the industry for this, which is called the component method. And the reason why it's called that is because all components are treated separately from a funding standpoint. So just as a quick aside, by component here, I'm talking about a project. That can be a roof replacement, a asphalt pavement project, a lobby remodeling, a swimming pool resurfacing. It's the thing that you're saving money for. So when I use the term component, those are the elements, the kind of the building blocks of the reserve study that the association is actively saving for. Okay, so I always have described this and think about it as the old-fashioned way. More and more communities have abandoned this and switched to the other method, which is called the pooled method. But there is some historical reasoning why this is old-fashioned. Before the year 2002, at least in the state of Florida, this was the only game. This is the only option you could do. When they updated the statutes, the Florida Administrative Code in 2002, that's when they allowed associations to begin pooling their reserves. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But for those of you who may be in older communities, if you're wondering why you would have ever chosen this, it was the only choice for a certain period of time. Now, the way I characterize this method is that I feel it's simple in theory, but it becomes much more complicated and troublesome when you actually try to use it, try to put it in practice. So to understand the method, right, this is just explaining how it works. I think it's very helpful if you think of each of your, each category of your reserve components as being handled or paid for out of a separate bucket of cash. Okay, so for the sake of this class today, let's assume we're talking about these 5 buckets. Okay, we'll call them the roof, elevator, painting, mechanical, and pavement. Okay. When you're using this straight line method, you determine the amount of funding going into each bucket every year using a very simple calculation. Basically, you take the cost of that component, subtract out any existing funds that you've already saved, right? How much money do you have in the bank now? And whatever is left over, the difference between these numbers, you divide that by the RUL, which is the remaining useful life, right? How many more years do we have before that gets done? The result of that calculation will tell you the amount required to fund that component in the following year's budget. Okay, so let's use our roof bucket, if you will, as our first example. Now, if you understand in this analogy, the total volume of the bucket represents the total cost of replacing the roof, right? We start with very little, we fill up the bucket each year, and once the bucket is full, we have enough money to replace our roof. Okay. The existing reserves, what you see in green here, these are the contents of the bucket now. And the difference here, the empty portion, is what I'm going to call the unfunded balance. But again, that's simply the difference between the total cost to replace the roof minus the existing funds already saved up. Let's put some actual numbers to it. Let's say that the cost of replacing the roof is $200,000. We have $140,000 in our roof reserve account. So 200 minus 140, my unfunded balance here is $60,000. Okay. My next step is to figure out how much money do I need to put into this roof bucket each year so that when the roof fails, I've got enough money to replace it. So now I'm doing my math. I take my $200,000 cost, subtract 140. The difference here would be 60,000. 60,000 divided by 3 years means I'm putting 20 grand a year into my reserve account to fill my bucket for the next 3 years in order to fully fund that roof. Okay. I would then move on and do a similar calculation for each of my remaining buckets, right? I've done the math for my roof. I would need to do it for elevator, painting, mechanical, and so on. Now, as this plays out over time, what you're seeing kind of depicted on the screen here is very typical. You have a variety of different funding positions. Depending on how accurate your assumptions were for life expectancies and costs, some accounts may be very well funded. You've got a lot of money set aside, while others are not. Now, the best phrase I've used to explain this is that this is an inefficient distribution of the combined cash on hand, right? In other words, you have money that might be locked up in one account where it would be very advantageous, very helpful to move it over to some other project, maybe that's a higher priority, but you can't do that, or at least you can't automatically do that. And that's where things start to get very complicated. Some of the additional problems we find with this straight line method is, first of all, it's very often the case that there is no bucket, right? There's been no prior reserve fund established for some component. Maybe something got overlooked like concrete restoration. Or the funds in that category might be too broadly defined. For example, you might see one large combined bucket, one account that's called mechanical. And that's supposed to capture everything from security cameras to fire alarms to the cooling tower. The problem there is that all of those things have very different life expectancies, very different costs. And if you're combining them under one broad category, you're kind of losing the spirit there. You're going to have to start to do some very complicated math to figure out how much money really needs to go in there, considering there's a bunch of moving targets within that one thing. From a management standpoint, maybe you managers can relate to this. The component method we think is a much more of a headache. The reason is that under this method, the statutes require that the owners have to vote and approve the moving of funds from one place to another. So if I went back a couple slides to my bucket picture there, and I have a bunch of money sitting in one account and I want to move it to the other one, I actually would have to get a quorum and pass a vote to do that. Now, I think for most associations, getting apathetic members involved to do anything that requires a vote is very, very difficult. I think especially so when you're talking about moving money around, right? We see that very often that residents are skeptical and they're hesitant to give that approval unless they fully understand why. Sometimes that means the board and the manager have to call special meetings. You have to get your attorney involved to send out emails and explanations. It's not just an easy thing to do to move money from one place to another. Now, lastly, the most significant problem with this method is that because it is more conservative, because associations are not efficiently distributing the sum of their money across the whole spectrum of things they have to pay for, it ends up costing the owners and the associations a lot more each year to fund their reserves. Okay, I'll tell you just anecdotally from our own data. Each year we look back at the reserve studies we've produced and we look at the funding recommendations for our clients that are using this old school straight line method. Now, just to be clear, when we do their studies, we do show them this method, but we also show them what would happen if they pooled the reserves together so that they can see what the difference might be between those two. So in a typical sample size, hundreds of studies, what we found was that the average difference was about 200%. Okay, so I'm going to make that more clear. On average, our clients who are using the straight line method would require triple the amount of funding from their owners if they stay in that method compared to if they pool the reserves, right? So another way to say that is they could cut their reserve obligation by 2/3 if they switch from straight line to pool. Okay, given that basically every single association we've ever worked with is on a mission to cut costs and lower the budget, one of the most effective ways you can do that if you're using straight line reserves now is to pool your reserves. Okay, so let's talk about that. What is the pooled method? Okay, so the other term for this is called the cash flow method. And in our opinion, this is absolutely the way to go, right? So again, for more context, I talked about this being only approved since 2002, but being that we're a company that's a lot older than that and we operate all throughout the US, I will tell you outside of Florida, the pooled method is basically universal. Okay, we have offices from coast to coast. Our Florida office is the only one that still has any clients using this straight line method. So to contrast this from the other option, I would say the pooled method is arguably more complex in theory. But once you've gotten the hang of it, all right, once you have the right tools for it, it actually becomes a lot more straightforward and simpler to use at budget time. All right. One of the most common questions that we get when we have this presentation is that if we have the straight line method now, but we're interested in switching to the pooled method, how do we do that? So we added this switch here just to talk about the process, and there is some new information here. First and foremost, I want to just point out a board can create a pooled reserve account all by itself, and that's always been true. The board could always say, going forward, as of this upcoming fiscal year, all of our new incoming reserve cash is going to go into a pool of funds. Now, in prior years, right, there was a next step where you would actually have the members vote to approve that process, or I should say approve the transfer of existing cash into the new pool. But as of summer of last year, with the passage of House Bill 913, specifically condos and co-ops, do not need to have that vote. The entire thing can be a board decision. So if you are on a board listening to me right now, you can move from straight line to pooled without the input of your owners. I guess I'll say for HOAs, you may want to double check that with your legal counsel. I think any association should verify there's nothing in their governing documents that prohibit it, but we believe that the same process should be true for HOAs as well. Okay. It can be a little bit complicated. If you're unsure of how to do that, you would probably want to talk to your association's accounting team, maybe have an attorney. Certainly, if you've got a reserve study company, we can help you with that. But it's a one-time process, and once it's done, I think you'll be very glad that you made that switch to this pooled method. All right, so to explain it more fully, the best way that I've found to kind of talk through this is using the same bucket analogy. Only now, imagine that I'm taking all those separate buckets of cash that I talked about before, and I'm dumping that into one big bathtub, and I stir it all around. Okay. By doing that, I've essentially removed the labels from any specific categories of reserve funds that existed before. Now, all of the reserve money is collectively available for any component on their reserve schedule. Okay, in other words, there's no such thing anymore as a roof reserve dollar, which is different from a painting reserve dollar, which is different from an elevator dollar. It is all reserve money, and all of that money is collectively available and much more effective and efficiently available to the association. Okay, going to walk you through the process now of how we develop a reserve budget using this method. But the first step of that process is exactly the same no matter what you're doing. Just highlight the foundation of any good reserve plan is an accurate component list. Okay, so it doesn't matter if you're using straight line or pooled, if you're wrong with your life expectancies and cost estimates for the things on your schedule. Okay, so start there, either as a board or using a professional for guidance. You have to develop your list correctly. You have to make sure that all of your life expectancies and costs are accurate, because what you do with that information is you create a timeline of future expenses, right? You have to create the kind of the need profile, the obligation. When are you going to need to spend money? Only then can you work backwards and figure out how much money you will need to have. Okay, so it might look something like this. Let's say you've got a reserve study, or you did this on your own, you put together a 30-year timeline. And each year, you're going to see what approximate amounts get spent on your assets for that year. So it's been a year or two since we've updated the slide, but let's just say we're starting with 2026. We're looking out, 8 or 10 years. Obviously, we have a big spike here, quite a few years where there's little to no reserve spending going on, but we've got a clear obligation that we need to be preparing for. The next thing you're going to do, right, once you know what those expenditures look like, the next logical step is to determine how much money, again, needs to go into your pooled account in order to provide for those expenses. So the first thing is understand what your starting position is. How much cash do you have now, right? So we're going to look at the sum total of all the reserve money at the start of the fiscal year. The next thing we're going to do is plug in kind of a temporary estimate for income to that account, right? How much money will be collected from the owners, and how much are you going to earn in interest? Okay, so that's already a nice advantage we have over the straight line method. When you're using the straight line method, everything is present day calculation. There's no look into the future. So you really cannot effectively model interest earnings or inflation. You're doing things just 1 year at a time. Once I understand my starting cash position and I see what's coming up in the upcoming years, I'm going to do the math. I'm going to take my starting balance. I will add in my assumption for reserve income, subtract out my reserve expenses, and I see where that leaves my account balance going into the next year. When I look at that next year, obviously I've got to make sure there's still some money in the bank. If I don't, then I go back a step and I plug in a higher income amount, a higher transfer amount. What am I collecting from my owners? If it's not enough, then I've got to go back and increase that. We're not allowed to design any sort of plan that has you running out of money. Okay, the beauty of doing this process using an Excel spreadsheet or a reserve funding software is that you're able to model the same types of projections for many years at a time, right? You just set up a formula, you copy and paste it, and it does the math for you. Cash in and cash out. Where does that leave me for the start of the next year? And I'm always making sure that my account balance is where I want it to be. That's basically the idea, right? So think back on the bathtub concept. If my pool of reserve funds is the water, or let's just say the money in a bathtub, and the drain at the bottom is the money that's leaving the tub to be spent on work that I need to do. Okay. But I've also got a faucet, which is my money coming in from the owners each month. As long as I'm keeping those relatively in balance, right? As long as there's enough coming in to at least cover what's going out, then I'm good, right? That's all we need to do. Make sure we don't drain the tub, right? Because if you run out of money, then you need a special assessment, you need a loan. That's obviously something we're trying to avoid. So um, the pooled method is going to be very advantageous for you guys to just understand compared to the buckets where you've got separate accounts for separate money. The pooled method looks at all of it together. All right, one very important point here. I talked about, not draining the tub, right? But do we want it to be going down to zero? No, right? In a perfect world, you're always going to have some cushion of money there. There's definitely differences of opinion over what is a big enough cushion, right? What is safe in terms of a cash on hand perspective. But I'm going to talk you through kind of the three objectives here. The first one is called baseline funding. Then we'll get into full funding and threshold funding, talking about each one in that order. So baseline funding, this is now defined in Florida statute. This is the riskiest option on the table. Now, it is legal, it is perfectly acceptable from the state's perspective, but I'm going to tell you right now, this is not a good idea. Okay, the objective here, when you're doing baseline funding, you're calculating the bare minimum amount of money that you need to put into reserves to keep that account balance above zero in the entirety of your timeline, right? So over the next 30 years, what is the absolute minimum you can do on an annual basis so that when you pay for things, you don't drain the account down to zero? Now, this term has been in existence for quite a long time in our industry standards. Again, back just this past year, Florida statutes have incorporated this for the first time. I want to make it very clear. When we historically have talked with managers and accountants and our clients, historically, I think there was a disconnect here. The problem has been that if you talk to most people in Florida and you ask them what they mean by fully funding a pooled reserve account, what they will describe to you is what I'm now clarifying is actually called baseline funding. It's the minimum required by law, unless you get a vote of your owners to approve something less than that. And that's historically what a lot of clients wanted to know. What is the minimum we can do so that we don't have to get our owners to vote and approve something else? And the law says that that amount, the number that needs to go into the budget to avoid any sort of voting, is the amount that would at least be keeping a positive cash balance and reserves over time. Anything above zero is considered acceptable. All right, I know I'm talking a lot on these slides. I'm going to actually show you guys some numbers, though, to illustrate what this looks like. Okay, this is a real example of baseline funding. A lot of numbers on the page here, but let me talk you through it. What I've got here in this left-hand column are the years, right? It's the full 30 years of this projection. And I'm seeing on the rows all of the cash positions and then the cash flow in and out for that year. Okay, so moving from left to right, we've got our starting reserve balance. That's the actual cash on hand, how much is in the pool. We've got the fully funded balance, which is a theoretical number telling us, what's the center of the bullseye? How much should they have at that point? We divide this by that, and that tells us percent funded. Okay, so for those, I touched on this a little bit earlier. Percent funded is a very, very important metric because it's a way of gauging the strength of the reserve fund at any point in time by taking a measurement. Okay, so continuing to the right, we've got the reserve funding number, how much is going into the bank that year. Are there any loans or special assessments? In this case, none. How much are we earning in interest? And then how much are we spending? So if you take the starting cash balance here, 1,107,000, I add in 102,400. I add my interest income. What am I collecting from the bank? And what am I spending? Zero. Okay, well then this plus this plus this minus that gives me my starting balance in the next year. So in this scenario, in 2024, would be their starting position. They're adding 102,000 from the members, collecting 11,600 in interest, not spending anything. So they would start the next year with 1,221,000 and change in the bank. Okay. Now, if I'm looking at this plan and I'm doing a baseline funding objective, what I need to focus on is the reserve expenses, making sure that there's always enough in the bank so that as cash goes in and cash goes out, I'm ending each year or starting each year with something left over. So here we're seeing an association that starts with 1.1 million in the bank, is putting away just enough money on an ongoing basis in reserve funding here, such that when they pay for their expenses, they're scraping the barrel, but they're ending up with $110 left over. The state would say this is sufficient. Now, in reality, does anybody out there think this is a good idea? At a point in time when they should have more than $500,000, they have $110. So even though it's above zero, I would say still a very, very bad idea, very risky. Because what happens if any of these projects come in a little more expensive or a little sooner than we thought? There's no margin for error here. So they're going to be very, very exposed to special assessments in this scenario. Now, we've talked about that kind of most extreme end of the spectrum in one direction. Now we're going to go over to the other side. The most conservative option is called full funding or fully funding the reserves. Now, to be very careful and specific here, when I use this term full funding, I'm doing so in this context of CAI National Reserve Study Standards, which is defined as setting a reserve funding goal to attain and maintain reserves at or near 100% funded. Okay, as I said before, most people in Florida have this concept of fully funding, which is actually baseline, right? It was the minimum required by law, but I'm trying to expand your horizons here and understand that there is different ways that is interpreted. So just for a quick aside on this, CAI, who adapted these reserve study standards in 1998, that was 4 years before pooled funding was even allowed in Florida. So if we could turn back time, it would have been very nice if we could have been in the room there and explained that, look, there's existing industry terminology that defines this more clearly. We didn't get that. So here we are. This definition, as I said, is to do something different. It is to try to not just be above zero, but aim for the center of the bullseye, right? Try to get your reserves, your cash on hand to be equal to the value of deterioration. Something we talked about in the first couple slides today. Now, how would that look? Okay. So this is the same client spending the same amount in expenses and starting from the same position. But if they are fully funding instead of baseline funding, the goal is not to just stay above zero, but actually to get to, right, to attain and maintain reserves at about 100% funded. So it costs them some more money each year. But the advantage of that is they never get to that danger point, right? The lowest amount they ever have here is still hundreds of thousands of dollars in the bank, even after they've spent 2.2 million the prior year. But this is going to be a much more safe and steady and easy to recover position should something go sideways. Okay, here's another way to look at this comparison. On this chart here, we're looking at percent funded here on this left-hand vertical axis. On the bottom, we've got time, right? The 30-year projection. Now, each of these green, orange, and purple series of dots represents a different funding objective. So here we're looking at the green dots. This is measuring percent funded over time. And you see that it's always in this strong 80 to 90% range. They have a period where they spend a bunch of money, but then a very quick recovery back up to 100%. Okay, the orange dots here represent the baseline plan. Now that actually looks not so bad for the first 10 years or so, but they're whittling away at their cash position, and it then falls off a cliff, right? We get down to this point where they had 110 bucks in the bank. So even though it's not zero, it's getting very close to zero, and it's a very high risk for the owners. And when they do recover, it's never back up to the same position of strength that they had before. Okay, so what does this mean in terms of actual dollar amounts? You may recall the baseline funding objective called for $102,400 in reserve money in the first year. The full funding plan was $127,500. So that's a difference of about 25%. I will tell you that's actually a higher average or a higher difference than we see on average. In most cases, the difference between baseline and full funding, okay, the riskiest and the most responsible thing, is a marginal difference of about 15 to 20%. But put it this way, even in this example at 25% higher, the real net effect, the real dollar amount per owner was $15 per owner per month. Okay. Less than $1 a day per owner in this example meant the difference between doing the riskiest possible thing, right? Driving to the edge of a cliff, and the safest, most responsible thing. Now, keep in mind the current plan here, what we see in the purple, this is their existing budget. So we say, okay, if you just continue on the track that you're on, not increasing anything at all, you're going to fall off a cliff. You will absolutely drive yourselves into the ditch and need a massive special assessment or a loan, and you're never going to recover from that. So here's the takeaway. If you're going to have to increase your reserve funding no matter what to stay above zero, for a little bit more money, you will do yourselves a huge benefit, a huge service in staying financially strong for a much longer period of time. Okay, got just about 2 or 3 more slides here. Then we're going to go to the Q&A. I already see 8 questions there, so now's your time. Feel free to answer or ask any questions you like, and we'll go to those in a couple of minutes. But 1 or 2 final things to talk about. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this concept. It's pretty simple to understand. Basically, threshold funding is anything between baseline and full. Okay, so that means that we're picking a target, or our client is helping us or asking us to help them do this, and then we're designing the funding plan accordingly. So they might say, for example, okay, we don't need or we don't feel we need to get to 100% funded. What does it look like if we're just getting to 70%? Okay, another way might be to say, we want to make sure we never drop below $1 million in our pooled reserve fund. That's our safety net, right? We're comfortable at that range. As long as we don't go below 1 million, what does that look like? That's fine. All right. But the problem that I feel with this threshold concept is that it is more subjective, right? You could have a board in one fiscal year saying that they think 50% funded is a good number. And the next year you have a different board in place and they say, well, what if we did 20%? Okay, well, that now you have this kind of yo-yo effect going into your budget each year where you're targeting different threshold numbers, right? These are scenarios that are unique for each client. We will happily, work out the numbers for them. But as I talked about on the last slide, it usually makes more sense to just set 100% funding as your target than to pick something less than that. It does not cost that much more money to do it that way. All right. So a couple parting thoughts, and then we'll go to the Q&A. Hopefully everybody by now agrees, you guys all signed up to be here in the middle of your day. I don't think you would do that if you didn't think that reserves are important, right? And I hope that everybody understands reserve funding is important in the present and in the future. But the future is the result or the byproduct of what you do now, right? The choices you make now will determine your future. So if you've got objections to reserve funding, if you have owners that are saying, we don't want to pay more, we're not going to be here, it's not my problem, blah, 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 that's not the right mindset. Remember, the board of directors has a fiduciary duty to act in the best interest of the association, okay? When you're designing these annual budgets, right? Think hard. If you're using the straight line method, you may want to reconsider that. There is a better approach out there. And then ultimately, you've got to think about what your goal is, right? Whatever your tool is one choice, but then the goal of what you're actually trying to do is another choice, right? The goal, of course, is never to just keep the dues low and keep the members happy, right? This is not a popularity contest. You're a leader in this industry, whether you signed up for it or not. The fact that you're here, right? If you're a reserve specialist, you're a property manager, you're a board member who's entrusted with caring for your community, it is all of our responsibility to educate the people that we work with and to help them make wise financial decisions. So let's see. That's all we've got for the course material. Again, I've got my email address up on here. So if we don't cover anything today that you guys wanted to learn more about, we can certainly do that. I'm going to turn my camera back on here. Ashley, did you want to say anything before we dive into?
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Will. So comprehensive. You always do a great job explaining it. Really, really nice job. This is the Q&A portion. So for anyone who does want to jump off, you can. You don't have to stay for the Q&A. You will still get the credit. I did just go ahead and launch our poll to get your feedback on how we did today. Very important. So if you can please do that, we would really appreciate it. I will be emailing out this presentation, a link to this video recording, Will's contact information, and then information on all of our future courses. So I'll leave the poll up. So if you do have to leave, we really appreciate you coming. If you are able to stay for the Q&A, we're going to hit that right now. So I will, yeah, let's hit the Q&A then, Will.
You got it. All right. Yeah, so if you and Brandon want to take a look at the list as I'm going
Yeah.
along, because I know some people are going to probably ask, is this recorded and stuff that we've already talked about. So just to kind of
Yep.
keep the list
I'll take
going.
care of those. I have been throughout, but
I
I'll take a look again.
You're always great about that. Thank you. Okay, so before I answer any questions, I'm going to make a couple comments. First of all, I'm not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. So if you are not sure or still want to explore something, please, consult your attorney. Make sure that you're doing things correctly in accordance with statute, in accordance with your governing documents. So I've also haven't seen any of these questions in advance, so I'm going to do my best off the top of my head to answer them as clearly as I can. I apologize if I didn't quite get the essence of your question. You can certainly feel free to reach out to me by email or give us a phone call. But I'm going to try to answer as many questions that are as good for the group as possible. If there's anything here that is very specific or unique to one circumstance, and I really wouldn't be able to know the answer to that without having done a reserve study for that property, I might skip over that one. So I'm not doing that to be rude, but I just want to make sure this is as good for the group as we can. I've got 24 open questions so far, and I'm just going to start ripping through them from the top. So Ellen's question: what is the legal or best practices frequently to get a professional reserve study done? Okay, so across the country, there's different legislation in various states. I would say that, well, specifically in Florida, the only requirement we have for any type of reserve study at the moment is specifically for condos and co-ops that are 3 stories and above to have what's called a structural integrity reserve study done. Right now, that is at least once every 10 years, or it may be required under certain circumstances. But that's put that aside. What you should be doing, certainly the best practice, is to have a formal reserve study update at least about every 3 years. The reason is all of the underlying data, the life expectancies, the costs, the inflation assumptions, the interest assumptions, those are all moving dials, right? Those things all change on a regular basis. And so you want to make sure you're always adapting to the latest current information for your property. So about every 3 years to have a fresh on-site inspection and evaluation done is good. Okay, again, some of these are just in context. I'm going to have to move past. Okay, from Samuel. Reserves language is usually broad, if any at all, in most HOA governing documents. In my HOA, no record exists stating we must use the pooled or straight line method. Is there a default type of reserves if not stated in writing? If yes, how should this method be recorded? Good question. So I would say if it's silent and you have the option to choose, then I would choose the pooled method. You might want to look at your balance sheet, at your bank statements, talk with your CPA if you have one. If your reserves are currently structured in a straight line format, right? If you look at your balance sheet and it says swimming pool reserves, clubhouse reserves, gatehouse reserves, tennis court, and they are clearly itemized with separate account balances, that would be straight line. But if it's silent to that, if it just says reserves, then they're probably pooled. Okay. As far as recording the method going forward, I don't know that you would need to formally do that in your documents. I'm sure you can, but usually it's a choice the association makes. And I would say if you have that choice, better to choose the pooled method. Okay. Irene has a question. Our property manager sets up and looks over our HOA budget. The board does not get involved till the budget is set. Is this the wrong way to handle our yearly budget? I would say that doesn't sound very advantageous. Remember, the board are the ones that are financially responsible for the community. Okay, the manager serves at the pleasure of the association. You might have a great manager who's doing a really good job, and you guys are happy with the outcome and everything is above board. But I think the board of directors needs to be involved the entire way, right? It is not just something that you delegate to your manager and hope that they get the numbers right, right? When I was on my board, we started in probably late July, early August. to to adopt our budget by October, November. So your board definitely should be involved much earlier than that, not waiting until the very end, because otherwise, if there's an error or a mistake, you wouldn't catch that for maybe too many weeks or months. Okay. All right, question from Brenda. If there were no reserve funds and the board creates a pooled reserve, do we still need a meeting to pass it? I would say no. If you're creating pooled reserves where you had none before, you're not switching from anything. You're just creating it for the first time. I don't think that would require any sort of meeting or approval to do that. Let's see. Okay, Catherine's question. Pooled reserves mean lower contributions, but the end costs for repairs, et cetera, are the same. So I'm unclear as to why pooled would be better in the long run. Well, it has to do with that inefficiency, right? When the reserves are broken up into buckets or separate categories, and you've got money sitting in one place, I have to have tunnel vision, right? I'm only looking at that bucket, ignoring the reality that I might have money sitting somewhere else, and I have to charge my owners, I have to assess my owners to put money into that bucket, even though there's some other funds sitting there that are just, you know, totally available, but not for that thing. So that's really the reason why. Sometimes I explain it using a checking account analogy. Let's say instead of one checking account, your family had 10 checking accounts, and you had groceries and car payment and date night and electric bill and everything else. Okay, if you wanted to go to Publix and buy new groceries, but your grocery checking account was down very low, but your date night reserve account had a ton of money in it, it seems like it would be obvious that you would want to move some money over, but you can't necessarily do that in a straight line format. You'd have to get the owners to vote on it and approve it, and you have to treat your budgeting as if it's unavailable, right? So that's really the heart of why it's more expensive to do straight line. It's because of those inefficiencies and those inequalities between the cash on hand and each bucket. Okay, Stephen's question, is there a tax obligation on interest earned in the reserve account? I'm not a CPA, so I would defer, normally what we try to do in our studies is show the net after tax interest earnings. So it is possible that you might have some tax obligation there, but every circumstance is a little bit different. It kind of depends on how your community is structured, condo or HOA, what tax forms are you filing? So I would say for the purpose of the reserve study, if there is a tax owed, what you want to capture is the interest earnings net of the tax, because that's really what the owners get to keep and what helps offset what you would otherwise need to collect. All right. Some of these I think we answered over the course of the class. Some of them are a little bit repeating. James has a question. I shared a 30-year plan. Is there a minimum time frame? In short, is a 15-year look okay? In accordance with our industry standard, National Reserve Study standards, it's a minimum of a 20-year forecast. 30 years, I think, is very typical. 15 is a little bit short, but it depends on what it is you're actually looking at there. I'm going to turn off my screen share here. Okay, so if you're defining something as having a 15-year planning horizon versus 30, but you're trying to hit the same goal, right? If you're trying to become 100% funded in 15 years than in 30, that's actually going to be more painful for the association, right? That's like planning to retire at 50 instead of at 65. If you're trying to hit some high number, but you're giving yourselves shorter time to do it, that may end up costing you more, and that might not be the best choice. So typically you're looking at 30 years, 5, 10, 15-year outlooks are kind of naturally part of that. You can see where you're going to be at each of those intervals. But if the overall goal is to try to get to 100% funded, then you should be looking out at something like 30 years to give yourselves time to get there. All right, let's see. John's question. To be clear, money collected under straight line method can be moved by board vote into a pooled reserve. Yes, as of July 1st of last year, when they passed House Bill 913, it is clearly now the case that that's a board decision, not a membership decision. So In prior years, if any of you guys took this class before, you might have seen where we said that you would have to get the majority vote of the owners to do that. It was considered a non-scheduled use of reserve funds. No longer. The legislature in Florida specifically wanted to make it easier to pool reserves and allow associations to take advantage of this method. So now it is just a board vote. But again, double check that with your attorney. If there's anything in your governing documents that say otherwise, you might need to abide by that. Okay, Troy's question says Sears, which is Structural Integrity Reserve Study versus regular reserves, any differentiation pertaining to today's discussion? No, everything that I talked about today, I would say is true for structural reserves or non-structural. All the concepts about baseline funding, threshold funding, full funding would still apply. The only difference that you're kind of alluding to is if you've got a structural integrity reserve study and a regular reserve study, then you would have basically two parallel sets of recommendations, but each one would follow one of those two profiles. So yeah, whether you're talking about Sears or regular reserves, I would say you still want a pool and you want your pool to be attaining 100% funded, ideally. For anybody else who's curious about what I'm talking about there, the structural integrity reserve studies, we do have a whole nother presentation on that. Maybe, Ashley, that's something we can do sometime this spring after this current legislative session ends, just so we can update on anybody if anything there changes. All right, question from Jack. Is it acceptable to have reserve funding contribution vary, i.e. up 1 year, then down, or do you always try to keep it even or increasing? Ideally, what you want to do, Jack, is have a consistent contribution that increases a little bit each year just to keep up with inflation. So typically when we do our studies, we figure out what is needed in year 1, and then we're allowed to increase that by the same rate of inflation that we apply to the costs of the components. So if we're assuming that their roofs and their elevators and air conditioning and all that stuff is going to get up by 3% each year, then the contribution into reserves should also be increasing by 3% each year to keep pace with that. So in some cases, you can have kind of a ramp if there's a really big expensive project, and once you clear that project, then you can decrease your reserves. That does happen on occasion, but for the vast majority of properties out there, you're going to want to have steady, consistent, small increases each year. All right, James' question, state mandated value of project to be included in a reserve study. So as of last year, another thing that changed, it says for condos and co-ops, the requirement to include things in reserves is roofing, painting, and pavement, regardless of their cost, and anything else over $25,000. Okay, now that's what the state says. That's probably not a good approach for a lot of associations. Okay. If you've got a small community with 20 units in it, if you're ignoring things that are below $25,000, remember you're only dividing them by 20 people. So if you're not including it in your reserves, you are running the assumption that you will be able to afford that in your operating budget. And if you've got 5 or 6 things that are all, let's say $15,000, it's legal to include those, or I should say to exclude them from your reserve plan, but you still have to pay for them one way or another. So you're just shifting the obligation over to your operating side or possibly to a special assessment. So 25,000 is the mandatory minimum number, but for a lot of communities, probably want to set that bar a little lower. Okay, Lee's question here. Any recommendations for investment strategies for reserve money? Yeah, this is something that's actually kind of evolving the last couple of years. Historically, associations could only put their reserve money into very safe investments like CDs, money market accounts, treasuries, things that are in theory never going to lose money, right? The principal is always protected. There are now some kind of more creative options that are coming out there from different banks and investment advisors that are looking into index funds and mutual funds and things that might be able to get a better return. Up until now, about the most exotic thing you could do is maybe laddered CDs. One of the major things when it comes to reserve funding is liquidity. So any sort of investment strategy needs to maintain liquidity when you will need the money. So you have to look at your timeline of expenses and see, okay, in 10 years, we're going to spend a ton of money. So let's not have a very risky strategy leading up in the 10th year just in case the market crashes, right? You would want to shift to something a lot more safe at the time you're going to need that money. If you're in a new association where nothing really happens for 20 years, maybe you can afford to take some more risks. But my best recommendation would be talk to a CPA, talk to an investment advisor, make sure you're being very careful there. Okay. Andres' question, according to the new state regulations, when is it due for the reserve study and structural studies, et cetera? So under our new state regulations, you should have had this done already. If you're a condo or a co-op that is 3 stories and above, the deadline has passed. It was originally December 31st of 2024. Last year it got extended to the end of 2025. That's all now in the rear view mirror. So if you have not done your structural integrity reserve study, you are now running the risk of compliance enforcement by the state, which could include finding of board members, removal from their positions, not being able to qualify for types of lending or insurance. So, those again being the only current state regulations, specifically for condos and co-ops for the Sears, that deadline is passed. So if you haven't done that, the sooner the better. We can certainly help you with that. If you go to our website, reservestudy.com, we can put together a proposal very quickly for that if you need it. Okay, let's see. I'm going to skip over a couple of these just to move us along here. Alexandra has a question about our fees. How does that work? The fee for a reserve study is basically based on the time involved, right? So it's how much time are we going to spend on site doing our physical inspection, and then how much time is it going to require at the computer, calculating costs and quantities and researching things with the board and presenting the study and the findings and all that. So, most of the time we're coming up with a ballpark, hourly figure for us, and then applying that as a fee to the client. So, most reserve studies, are going to be well under $10,000, and certainly even less than that for update studies. So if you've had one done in the past, usually the cost to update it would be significantly less than the cost of the original. But again, it's a function of where the property is located, how old it is, how many components they have, what time of year it is, all those things. If anybody would like to get a proposal, again, you can do that via our website. Okay, take a sip of water here. Bruce's question, can I combine the costs of all components, or do I have to do separate accounting for each one? So it never really makes sense to combine the costs of all components together, because there's never a time where you will replace all of them at once. Instead, what we look at is the proportion of each cost that you should have on hand relative to its age. Now, I guess maybe depending on the context of your question, if you have straight line reserves, then you do need to do separate calculations and calculate a separate account requirement for each one. But even if you have pooled reserves, just simply adding together the replacement cost of everything is actually not the process. That would be something you would do for an insurance appraisal, right? If a place burns down and you have to replace everything all at once, then you would care to know what is the combined cost of everything, but that's a completely different scenario. So sorry, Bruce, if I'm not catching the context there. Okay. Catherine's question. Hi, does every HOA need a reserve? We don't have any amenities and are not responsible for any roofs, painting, etc. Well, it sounds like if you don't have anything that you're responsible for, then the answer would be no. But if you have a private road, a monument sign, street lights, sidewalks, irrigation components, perimeter fencing, I mean, there's still a lot of things that HOAs can be responsible for that are not considered amenities. And if they're not responsible for anything on the residences themselves, that's a pretty simple one. But you'd have to kind of really look around and say, okay, well, what do we have? Do we have retention ponds? Do we have, any sort of infrastructure that we do care about and that we are responsible for, then you might need a reserve, but it is possible that you may not. Okay, let's see. James's question. As a new treasurer, I presented a 15-year plan with expenditures placed in time with inflation and used the bathtub approach to tell owners we would maintain a positive cash flow with a special assessment needed 3 years from now versus full funding. Is that okay? So I'm not sure if this is what you did, but I'll just say it anyways. In a reserve plan, you are not allowed to plug in a future special assessment. Okay. That's considered a balloon payment and it's specifically prohibited under the statute. So here's how that could work. Let's say there's a community that has a big project, 10 years from now, and they're going to spend $1 million. And the board is saying, well, here we are in the present day. Can we just get a spreadsheet together and show a $900,000 special assessment in year 9 or 10? Because that'll solve that problem, right? And that allows us to collect the bare minimum between now and then, because those poor souls who live here 9 years from now, they're going to pass the special assessment. That'll be their issue. You can't do that, right? That's prohibited. That's obviously kicking the can down the road and ignoring the true cost of ownership. So that would be prohibited, but I'm not sure if that's what you're saying. So I guess, yeah, in your question, you said maintaining a positive cash flow is good. You just could not, backdate or future date a special assessment. You would need to either model that in the first year or spread it out over the first several years, but you can't do that balloon payment approach. All right. Michael's question: how would you treat the depreciation of equipment that is regularly maintained, such as a community water fountain? Okay. Well, if you mean depreciation from a accounting standpoint, that's a different question. If you're looking to record that as something in your financial statements, that's a different approach. If you're asking about how do we estimate the useful life of something that is regularly maintained, I will say that we do already take that into account, right? We're assuming not just for a water fountain, but for everything, roofs, elevators, swimming pools, and so on, that the community is going to be maintaining those things. They're not just going to abandon them and not change air filters and not going to clean the pool and things like that. The only way that you get to the life expectancies used in a reserve study is by actively taking care of the stuff along the way. So if you're regularly maintaining it, as you should, that's great. Your reserve study specialist should be basing the useful life around that assumption, if that makes sense. All right. We're down to 7 questions. So I'm going to try to, let's see, we can go another 5 or 10 minutes. So I'm going to try to get through the rest of these. Ann's question here, can we reuse a special assessment which was for pool repairs towards a new pool? Do the board and residents have to vote on the change? Interesting question there, Ann. I would think that you would have to look at what are the nature of the repairs versus what do you mean by new pool, right? If it's more expensive to just demolish the pool you have and build a new one than to repair it, then I think it would probably be logical that whatever special assessment you collected for the repairs could go towards the replacement. If it's a different circumstance, if you've decided just kind of on a voluntary or a discretionary basis, we collected money for something and we're completely changing our scope of work because it's what we want to do, not because what we have to do, then I think that's more of, arguably a material change, and the owners may have to vote on that, but that's a great question for your attorney. I would need a lot more info on that one. All right. Patricia's question: can pooled funds be moved from one line item if monies aren't used to another line item that ran out of money? All items are in reserves. Well, again, the beauty of the pooled method is that you're not allocating money to one line item or another. It is all collectively available. So you're not actually moving any pooled money in that case. You're just spending it on something else. So maybe I'm tripping up on the way you asked the question, but if your reserves are truly pooled and your reserve schedule includes both of the things that you're anticipating doing, there's no need to move any money or vote at all. It's all just collectively there at that point. Okay. It's Tamara, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it. If your community is replacing roofs in the next 12 to 18 months and total pooled reserves are below the cost for the roof replacement cost, would there ever be a reason for a board to return funds to the owners to lower their dues? Is this fiscally irresponsible? Asking for a friend. It's very, very rare that a board would ever be wise to return money to the owners. It has happened. I've seen that happen a handful of times in the last 18 years, but it's usually in a case where an association is no longer responsible for something. Like if they've been saving for private roads and then they work with the county and they remove their entry gate and their roads become public and therefore maintained by the county, any road reserve money that they had been collecting in that case could go back arguably to the owners. But the best way to answer that question would be to do a reserve study and find out, other than your roofs, what else is coming up on the list. If you are 1,000% funded and you have 10 times the amount of money that you will ever need, even after considering everything else, maybe there's a situation where you could start to refund that money or just just not collect it anymore. But that's a unique circumstance. So it's possible, but highly unlikely. All right. I think some of these we've already asked or answered. Okay, let's see. Samuel has a follow-up for me. He says, for consideration, and he says, I'm not an attorney. Regarding the change from straight line to pooled reserves, several attorneys published on their website that HB 913 applies to condo and co-op associations, not HOAs. I would say that's true. The first sentence in HB 913 also states the act relates to condos and co-ops, and the changes are for statute 718 and 19, not 720. I totally agree with all that. My reason for saying that I think it probably would apply is because in a lot of cases where HOA statutes are silent on a particular topic, they will kind of default to what is true for condos and co-ops. So for what it's worth, that could be true. It says regarding moving funds, once the accounting method is changed, several attorneys agree HB 913 does not allow reserves funding to be moved into the new pooled or straight line account without a majority vote. The method may be changed, but nothing says they can move the cash. It's an open question. I have heard this argued both ways. I've talked to attorneys and accountants who see that the spirit of that change was to specifically make it such that the cash could be moved, not just choosing the method. They're working on a new legislative session right now. That was actually very specifically one of the things that I put forth to the legislature that I would like to be clarified to make that crystal clear. That not only can the board change the method to pooled, but also take the old straight line of cash and put it into the pool. I will agree with you that that's a little bit ambiguous, but I know from the folks that were in the room that the spirit of that was certainly to allow them to move the cash as well. Otherwise, there's kind of no point in making any change to the legislation. Okay, two left here. Thank you guys, by the way, for staying on. I really appreciate all the time here. Leah's question: when you put together the cost of replacement, do you prefer to provide the cost today with a percent increase for economic impact year to year, or just do today's cost and percent increase of base replacement cost? An example, replace a roof at $1 million now, but do 15 years from now. So increase $1 million with 3% each year over 15 years to get that total amount. That's what we do. We take the current cost of, if you had to do this project today, what would it cost you? Now, if reality says it's 15 years from now, I'm going to build in 15 years of escalating compounding inflation so that 15 years from now, it's going to be what it costs you at the time the work actually gets done. That's the target we're shooting for. So let's say that's 1.3 million. I need to design my funding plan so that my client has 1.3 million 15 years from now, even though it only costs $1 million today. All right, let's see. Thank you guys for the feedback. I really appreciate it. And my last question from Janice, how to account for the difference in useful life, which is a financial construct, and insurable life for insurance coverage? Very interesting question, one that happens quite a lot. So insurance companies view deterioration and things on a very different perspective than we do, right? So the useful life of something from a reserve study standpoint is the point at which you should be financially prepared to do this thing. So if that's, let's just say a roof, typical useful life for a roof might be 20 years. So I'm going to plug in 20 years into my reserve study. So from a budgeting standpoint, that's what my client is shooting for. Now, their insurance company may say, after 15 years, your roof has no insurable value left, right? That's like, we're not going to pay full price for an old, clunker car that you're driving around. So that if you get into an accident, we're not going to buy you a brand new, BMW or something like that. So there can be a difference between the useful life in a reserve study and what your insurance company says. The classic example of that is roofs. I guess, where those intersect is if an insurance company is going to mandate replacement of something at a certain time and the client has no option or no way to get around that, then I would say they absolutely should be planning and budgeting for that event, even though in reality the roof could have gone a little bit longer. If they're going to be forced to spend the money to do it, I would like them to be prepared based on that time horizon. So we have started doing that in the last couple of years where we have clients that say, look, our insurance company told us they're going to drop us in 2 years because of the age of our roof, not its condition. Well, then the useful life used in the reserve study probably should match that because that's the financial obligation they have to consider. So that's it for today. Thank you guys very much. Really appreciate it. Ashley, thanks again for the opportunity, and hopefully we'll do this again soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Will. Really, really appreciate it. Really appreciate everyone joining us. You can always look for our upcoming webinars at campbellevents.org, and we hope to see you at a future event. So have a great day, everyone, and we'll see you at our next webinar. Thanks, Will.
Thanks so much. See you next time.
Thanks for watching. For more great educational content, click the subscribe button now.